Good evening and welcome to this installment of the Hagen History Center Spring 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Sherry, Museum Educator at the Hagen History Center. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jared Jenrette, Professor Emeritus in the Department of History, Politics, Languages, and Culture at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. Her talk tonight is entitled Erie's Women Warriors During World War II, Stories of Sacrifice and Change in the Greatest Generation. Historical memory reminds us that the past never dies, even when those people who have been exemplars of great sacrifice are no longer with us. Many women from Erie County, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding region decided that sacrifice was required as the nation battled fascist leaders on both the Atlantic and Pacific sides of the globe. These women experienced homefront and warfront, fear, loss, opportunity, and a time in their lives they would never forget. They joined all branches of the military and were deployed to all regions engaged in the war. And they took up positions at home, undreamed of before. Let's walk down memory lane and look at the World War II experiences of some of Erie's sheroes. Before I turn it over to Dr. Jenrette, just a few announcements from the Hagen History Center. We are currently closed to the public due to the pandemic, but we are working to complete new exhibits in our new exhibit building, as well as those in the Watson Curtsey Mansion and the Wood Morrison House on our West 6th Street campus. We plan to be open in late spring of this year. Our staff has created many blogs and videos that are available on our website at www.eriehistory.org, and we encourage you to check those out regularly. Dr. Jenrette has published, in the Journal of Erie Studies, Historical Journal of Massachusetts, and West Virginia History. She also co-authored Erie, the Invisible City, 1930 to 1960, with Joe Lathe, deceased, and Eeyore Bemko and Sarah Thompson. Most recently, her book chapter on North Carolina women on the war front of World War I was published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2018. Her great pride as an academic, however, is encouragement with the students, whether in the traditional classroom, on student trips, or study abroad. Dr. Jenrette.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you all. I'm very excited to be able to go back to a topic that I talked about one time, well, more than a decade ago at the Erie County Historical Society, and that is women from Erie, Pennsylvania, and that is Erie County during World War II. So let us begin, hopefully.
World War II proved to be a turning point not only in world history, but in American history, and especially in women's history. Women did a great deal to contribute to the war effort, not only serving in the military services abroad, but serving on the home front. They filled very untraditional positions in our business and industry, but they also served at home as mothers, raising children without their husbands, having to deal with rationing, feeding a family on food stamps. Things were very difficult, but they overcame that, and they did it in clever ways, such as victory gardens. They also joined organizations that helped look to our skies and protect our homeland. We owe a great deal to these brave women of northwestern Pennsylvania, and their contributions are worthy of study.
On a fateful Sunday in December 1941, residents of northwestern Pennsylvania were listening to the radio when the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor came and shook everybody up. The workshop city with the playtime spirit woke up to find that the world had changed dramatically. In fact, the attack woke up all of northwestern Pennsylvania and profoundly rearranged everyone's lives.
This was a relatively small urban center, but a critical industrial center for the United States. We have some important manufacturing sites in the city, and so the city, despite its decline in size and decline in importance is still relatively important on the eve of the Second World War.
People in Erie, Meadville, Warren, Titusville, Edinburgh, Cambridge Springs, Girard, and points in between found themselves glued to the radio, anxiously awaiting news of events in the Pacific. They only had to wait until the following day to hear President Franklin Roosevelt's speech before the Congress to know that the U.S. was at war against Japan and Germany.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Within a few short months, demographics changed in towns, cities, and countryside. On college campuses, buses came in and a large number of men left. Cleola Mumford looked out the window from her dorm room to see young college men boarding buses. She wondered exactly where they were going. Many of those young men never returned.
Everybody was gone, all the young men were gone.
So that was just a brief little introduction that we did, and I wanted to do it so that you could just get a feel for some images of Erie during this period, and also to honor my colleague, Dr. Lath, who is deceased, and Cleola Mumford and Lydia Ellen Gamble, women who worked in Erie's factories during the war. At the time that the war begins, the national population is about 105 million. Erie is at about 120. There are 284 manufacturing firms already in place in Erie, and almost 5,000 women were working in manufacturing in 1941 before we get involved in the war. By 1943, that number had more than doubled to well over 10,000. So what happens is that Paul McNutt is given authority to be in charge of what's called the War Manpower Commission. And what they concluded was that they needed woman power. So many men were leaving that they needed woman power. They needed women to work in industry. They needed women to work in journalism and in all types. They had women in agriculture. And so, in fact, there was so much emphasis on woman power that Paul McNutt was referred to as the czar of woman power. There was opposition, however. Not everybody was really excited about going to war. And about 3 months after Pearl Harbor, there were some men, about 57% of men favored all-out war against Japan, but not everybody. If you look at the first bullet, about 54% of men were unwilling for their wives to take full-time war jobs. About 30% were okay with it being full-time, and 11% were okay if the children were taken care of and if the wife could stand it physically. So even in times of great national stress, societal attitudes are difficult to change. What happens is, and I pulled up this excerpt from the Erie paper, there is an attempt locally, statewide, and nationally to encourage women and to persuade their families that it was important for women to get involved in the war. To be, as you can see, the Erie paper is asking, and I'm not going to read all of these, have you got a secret gift for understanding precision instruments that baffle most people? You can be an instrument specialist. You might be interested in aviation, so you might be an aircraft electrician or a propeller specialist or parachute riggers. And so the list goes on in terms of what the War Manpower Commission and the nation wanted women to get involved in. Of course, there is opposition to a lot of that. There are people who make jokes about it. There are cartoons in local newspapers where men are poking fun at women at the idea that women can fill these masculine positions, but time would tell. So everybody is familiar with that image of Rosie the Riveter, which perhaps the more recognizable one is the one that was on the very first slide where my title was, but then the Norman Rockwell one that's here in the middle of the screen, you can see Rosie is clearly very, very strong female physically, and kind of a devil-may care. I'm here, I'm not going to leave, I'm here to do my job. And obviously these other images there appear welders and someone who's working on ammo, and then this is clearly a much later photograph of an older woman, an elderly woman who is dressed as Rosie the Riveter, looking at photographs from the past. So again, some more images of women who were involved in different types of engagement during the war, pilots, civil defense, women as nurses on ships, and then of course riveters and welders and so forth. So one of the big questions that happens for women during this time is, what would they tell their grandchildren? So Mildred Gear, who was from northwestern Pennsylvania, said that one day she was listening to the radio and a fellow said, "What are you going to tell your grandchildren that you did during the war?" And she said she thought about it and thought about it and thought, "Oh my, what am I going to tell them? So I'm going to join." So I did, she says. It was funny, but it just hit me. What would I tell them? So that's how it happened. I went downtown and I got signed in. Mildred Gear was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where she and other women they were there for boot camp, and she spent the majority of her 2 years in the military serving meals for more than 2,000 soldiers per day. Another Erie woman, and I have to give a shout out to Jeff because he helped me find some information in the records at the archives about Mary Sullivan. And you know, there are thousands of Mary Sullivans, but Erie had a Mary Sullivan who was a sergeant who went to England actually to serve, and she worked with and served with a Women's Army Corps there at a base there. And her attitude was, you don't have to be tough to be a good first sergeant. The job means keeping peace in a large family by using a little tact and understanding. So some people refer to her as the mother of that group at that base. She was actually awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service during the war. During the early 2000s, or around 2000, we became involved at Edinburgh University in conducting interviews with different women. And I had the great honor of interviewing several, including Louise Jorgensen, who lived almost 100 years, October 25th, 1917 to July the 2nd of 2017. And this is Louise. I should say that some of the photos in this are clearly of the women that I'm talking about, and others are photos that I have found at various places online. But this is Louise Jorgensen here. And she said that when she heard the news about World War II, she says, "There's going to be a war and I'm going to be in it." Louise Jorgensen graduated from Hammett Nursing School in 1940 and enlisted in the Women's Army Corps actually prior to the start of the war. Indicative of the urgency of need for more nurses, there was very little time for the military to properly train female volunteers. According to Jorgensen, the military, that is, did little more than give the recruits their own copies of the Articles of War and sent them packing for destinations unknown. Louise Jorgensen spent a good deal of her time in Australia and in the South Pacific, so that's why I have these two maps up here, working on a hospital ship. And I don't know, this is the USS Comfort. This is not the ship that she worked on to my knowledge, but this is an example of a US hospital ship. And of course, you can see the female nurses in the front. She said she cared for German prisoners, including a German commander. They had to deal with problems of malaria, overcrowding, and the lack of adequate water supplies. She said, actually, and I have the quote on the screen, "The military turned on the water in the morning for only 30 minutes. In that brief time, 8 had to wash, dress, and do their own laundry. Cigarettes were a good bargaining tool, though, at 70 cents a carton, and we were allowed only 1 Coke a day." So this may be a face that some of you recognize, Dessi Reed Ford. Dessi lived from March 24th of 1920 until July 13th of 2013. Dessi was born in Anderson, South Carolina in 1920. Her family moved to Greenville, where she did her nurse's training at the Greenville General Hospital from 1938 to May of 1941 when she graduated. For young Dessi, she had always been influenced by the fact that her father was a veteran and that he had been treated at the Veterans Hospital in Columbia, South Carolina. So it really influenced her desire to want to serve in the military. She said her first experience as a nurse really didn't involve anything very exciting. She explained, I made beds and learned how to give baths, and then each year or 6 months you progress, so you would give up giving medication and you learn how to give shots. After learning how to give shots, she says, they advanced further. We learned how to give different treatments, operating room experience, and then into the children's ward. You just progressed each year until you became a senior. She describes the shift rotation as being different from today's nurses. So if you're a nurse out there listening, please don't be offended. Nurses work 12-hour shifts with 2 hours off. You didn't get long weekends or anything like that. You got maybe your weekend would be a Saturday afternoon and a Sunday morning, and you'd have to be back on duty on Sunday afternoon. That's what it was like back in those days. Ford may well have gone on to work as a private duty nurse, but fate had something in store for her. On December the 7th, 1941, when the attack happened, her plans changed. She says, I had just passed my state boards, and of course the world was already engaged in conflict. We called it the winds of war. She was motivated by her strong sense of patriotism to join the Women's Army Corps in January of 1942. Concerned about telling her parents of her decision, she walked into their house and sang to them, I'm in the Army now, I'm in the Army now. So Dessi gets sent to Europe. She gets sent to Oran, Algeria, which is where I have my cursor right here, the little dot, if you can see it on the screen. That is Dessi's first deployment. She served there for more than 2 years. Her unit traveled with the 82nd Airborne. When they arrived in Iran on May the 11th, 1943, then they departed later for an eastern location. They traveled for 5 days on a, quote, an old French train with 5 nurses jammed into a small passenger compartment. The barracks bags filled the center of the compartment. To sleep, they had to arrange the blankets on top of the bags and stretch out. We were jammed in so tight that if one person had to roll over, they had to call it out. So we all rolled at one time. In addition to taking care of wounded American soldiers, the Army nurses provided care for wounded Australian and British troops. Ford recalled, we would watch the planes go out in formations as they would go out on missions. We would see them come back with, we called it, quote, limping in, because there would be a vacant place in formation, and we knew that plane had either been shot down or was coming in with the wounded. I think one of the first things I remember most vividly is to see the plane that I knew had injured men, wounded men, come in for a landing and then explode. So these are some of the images. This is an image of a photograph of troops landing in North Africa in Oran. This is a field hospital, obviously a staged photograph, but these are what she referred to as C rations. If you've been in the military, then you would know them as just military rations. And so she said that one of the things they had to do was to learn how to deal with the kind of rations that they received. So after some time in North Africa, Dessi's group was sent to Italy, to down in the southernmost part of it here on the map, where the map is the red spot. That is an area called Taranto area, Taranto. And when she was sent there, she was actually sent from there to a small town called Bari, B-A-R-I. While at dinner one night, she said it was on December the 2nd, 1943. She and some friends were enjoying dinner in a local restaurant and had plans to go to the local opera house when the German Luftwaffe attacked ships, Allied ships anchored in the harbor. And you can see this is the bottom right in the black and white is a photograph of part of that attack, and then obviously the left an enhanced image of that same attack. She says the attack took the lives of hundreds of servicemen, members of the Merchant Marine, and civilians, and she saw it all. When the small harbor was bombed, quote, 17 ships went up, and the ship with our equipment was also bombed. I could see it. I was right there. As a matter of fact, I just missed it because I was supposed to go on one of the ships there that night. One of the 17 ships was loaded with ammunition and mustard gas. Ford's hospital ship was destroyed in the attack, and she recalled, we lost our equipment, our clothes, and our men, fortunately, were on a different ship, so they were not killed with that attack. From there, she was sent up the boot to a place called Foggia, Foggia, in the green here. You can see it, Italy, where she works there at an air base with a British Army ambulance battalion until the hospital's new equipment was installed. They provided medical assistance to wounded soldiers, primarily from the 15th Army Air Force and U.S. Army units, as well as British forces. Ford, like thousands of her counterparts, experienced witnessed a lot of things that she would never have witnessed had she not gone to Europe. She says, there were many nights when you saw a plane coming in, dropping flames. We knew they would have wounded on board. We would be on trauma call. We would have to stay overnight in the hospital. If anything happened, we would be called down. During one of those trauma call nights, as Ford assisted an ambulance, one of the attendants handed her a bloody sheet. She recollected, quote, in it was a body part. Because of the impact of the war, and we know today it's PTSD, psychiatric units and chaplains were stationed throughout the regions where there was combat. Not only did the fighting men need support, but so did the women who were there, who had to cope with the dead and dying also. Ford explained, we comforted each other. You had to get along. We needed each other. In addition to chaplains and psychologists or psychiatrists, of course, we're all familiar with the USO. And she says that she had the opportunity to meet Humphrey Bogart and Joe Louis during USO events. She says these were the things you had in between to keep you from going stark, raving crazy on the other side of the spectrum. Ford got opportunities to do some things that people who did not get deployed got to do. She got to see Rome and she went to Pompeii, she says. And of course, like other people, she met her future husband. His name was Robert Ford. And that is how Dessi Reed from Anderson, South Carolina, ended up in Erie, Pennsylvania, where she spent the majority of her life. So Erie had one woman who was killed during the war, Second Lieutenant Claire Reilly. This is an announcement about her graduating. This is from the Erie paper, and I found this early this morning. Claire Reilly graduated as a nurse from St. Vincent's Hospital in 1936, and what happens is that she goes into the military when the war starts, and she is stationed. She goes first to Atlanta, Georgia, and then she's transferred to Camp Lee, Virginia, and then on to North Africa in March of 1943. In July, actually on July the 1st of 1943, Lieutenant Reilly was returning to base in North Africa when a sentry fired towards what he thought was an unknown object, and Claire Reilly was killed instantly. She is memorialized. Her name is on the Erie County World War II Memorial that's over near Collegiate Academy High School. I did want to put down here that 777 men and women from Erie County paid the ultimate price for their service during World War II. A couple of other women that, one I had the opportunity to interview, Dolores Jones, talked about walking from home, which was 3 miles from the factory, walking 3 miles a day one way to go to work in Erie's factories. So that's 6 miles a day. And she would talk about the fact that it would be dark when she would leave home and it was dark when she returned home. Myrna Lucille Devore, I did not interview her, but I came across her and I just wanted to mention her. She was a teacher in northwestern Pennsylvania. During the war, she worked at Lord Manufacturing running a hydraulic press. She insisted that she was not unique because many other women were doing similar tasks. She said, quote, "I'm not news. There are a lot of other women like me working in the shops at defense work. The government needs us most here, so here we are." She was one of the first women to leave a peacetime occupation for a wartime job. She took it in stride and argued that she enrolled in a metallurgy job, quote, "because I've always been mechanically inclined. I've always fixed my own car. Steels have always interested me. Now that I work with them on my job, I thought I would like to know more about them." So those are a couple of, and these are images these are stock photos that I found. So I want to introduce you to Marjorie Hayward Troop. Marjorie Hayward Troop was one of the women that I interviewed after one of my grad students, Donna Mook, at the time interviewed, and a couple of other students also interviewed her. So Ms. Marjorie, as I called her, was very busy being interviewed by a lot of people from Edinburgh University. And what happened was, what really started this for us was that in 2000, I believe it was in 2000, the university newspaper, The Spectator, ran an ad that questioned the authenticity of the Holocaust. Did it really happen? So one of my colleagues at the time, Dr. Hoffman, Don Hoffman, who taught German history and Nazi history, he and I were quite upset about it, as were others. And so we were like, what can we do to challenge this in a meaningful way? And so we decided to start working on an oral history project and doing interviews. And so over the course of several years, students in my women's history class interviewed probably about 100 women from northwestern Pennsylvania who were either in the military or who worked in the factories in Erie and Meadville or Pittsburgh, or women who served by staying home and taking care of other women's children so they could go to work. And so when I called Marjorie Hayward Troop to make arrangements to go out and interview her, she was like, "Sure, come on, but I don't know if I can get through the interview." And so when I knocked on her door, she was in tears. This was around 2002, 2003. And she was in tears and welcomed me into her home. And we sat and talked for a long time. And I went back a couple more times and read also interviews that my grad student and undergraduate students had done with her. So let me tell you about her. She kept me spellbound during these visits with her. Like many women who worked in Erie's factories, replacing the men who were off to war, Marjorie did also. She worked at GE first, and then she worked at Hayes Manufacturing, and then back at GE. Working at General Electric, she made bomb fuses, and towards the end of the war, of course, they made refrigerators. She was from nearby Union City, and while she had many stories, I think one of the stories that touched me most was the story about her husband. Her husband's name was Hile, H-I-L-E, Hayward, and he was in the service and had been sent to Africa first, then to Italy, and then on up to France and Belgium. Excuse me. And she jokingly said to him in a letter, is there anything I can, well, she said to him in a letter, "Is there anything I can send you?" And he decided he wanted to kid with her. And so he said to her, "Well, I want you to go down to Layden's." Layden's was a bar in downtown Union City. He said, I want you to go down to Layton's and I want you to have a rum and Coke for me. And Marjorie said, well, I didn't drink. I had never even had a cup of coffee until I was about 25 years old. She was a young woman. She was about 22 or 23 when the war begins. And so she said, she told her mother, she said, I'm going to fix him. So I decided that I would send him a package, a Christmas package. They couldn't weigh more than 5 pounds. And so she went and bought a Coke. She bought a Coke, and this is the closest I could find. This is a 1945 vintage Coke bottle. Of course, the one that she bought had Coca-Cola in it. And of course, you can see the ad with the soldier, and then you can see a photograph of troops drinking Coca-Cola, cases of Coke. And so she wrapped that Coke in cotton. She sent things like, she sent a razor and a shaving brush and some candy and some chewing gum and shipped it off. She said, well, the package went first to Africa. She was hoping it would get there by Christmas. Then it went to Italy. Then he was killed in January. Eventually, the Coke, the shipment, the package came back to her. Everything inside that box was damaged except for that bottle of Coca-Cola. She saved that bottle of Coke. And by the way, let me back up for a minute. She was pregnant when he went off to war. They had already had 2 children, 2 daughters. And before he had been deployed, she had visited him at Camp Lee down in Virginia. And she had gotten pregnant. And so he never saw his son. So later on, I mean, she kept this Coke. It came back to her. And what she did was she took the Coke and she put wax around it, dripped wax around it to seal it. And I saw it in 2003 when I interviewed her, and it was almost a full bottle of Coke. It had not dissipated. And she said that her 3 children, that with each one of them, every time their wedding came up, they said, Mom, I'm going to drink Dad's Coke at the wedding. And to my knowledge, they never did. She said that the kids, she said they couldn't do it. She said they could not do it. When, V-mail, V as in voice, V-mail, was the method of communication between families and troops. And there are these little sheets, they're almost like photographic pages. And so she had been writing him and didn't really get a lot from him. But after he got killed, she received about, she said she got almost in just a short amount of time, received about 140 V-mails from him that had just been backed up that she had not gotten while he was alive. The young man, the 14-year-old boy that brought her the telegram about his death, later came to see her, and he actually called her and he said to her, "Are you Marge Hayward?" And he says, "I'm the boy who delivered the telegram." Of course, that boy was the grandfather, so this was much later in life. So that's a very serious side of Marjorie Hayward Troop's story. And one of the things about her was that she didn't mourn when he died. She said because she had 3 small children and she was very young. She was 22, 23 years old. And her mother said, "You don't have time to mourn. You can do that later. You can mourn later." And so she said she didn't mourn. So when I went to talk to her, she had started mourning, and it had actually started as a result of an activity that the Erie County Historical Society was doing, and that they were having roundtables about World War II, and she was involved in those. And that's when Marjorie Hayward Troop started mourning the loss of her first husband, Hyle, who was killed in the Battle of the Bulge, by the way. So let me tell you a couple of more things about her. I'm almost through here. She told me a story that happened at work one time, and I don't remember if this is at Hayes Manufacturing, I believe it was, She liked to sing. She was very extroverted, and she was a fan of Judy Canova. And she said that one day she got up on the work table in the shop and started singing a Judy Canova song. And the supervisor came out and saw her and didn't say anything to her. And the next day she came back to work, and she's called to the office, or to the cafeteria area actually. And she walked in, and the supervisor said to her, "So you want to sing? So sing." They had pushed a piano in to the cafeteria. And so they, during their breaks and during their lunches, they were able to entertain each other. So this is, I think I'm not going to play this. Everybody knows the Andrews Sisters, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. I put that in for fun in case we had time, but I'm looking at my phone and seeing that it's time to move on. So life goes on. Life goes on for everybody. And so I would ask you tonight, how do we remember these women and those in our families? Maybe you've got somebody in your family who's still around, who served during World War II, or if not World War II, Korea or Vietnam, or the Middle East, and so forth. And so I would encourage you to find ways to remember them for posterity. We didn't always do that with our women heroes. The women Air Force service pilots were not recognized for their vital contributions until 1973, and not really full acknowledgement until President Obama gave them the Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. And so you can see these are some of the images of some of those women. And the bottom right, of course, is a group of women from different generations who are present when he signs the Gold Medal Award. So I tried to find some examples of monuments to women during World War II. This is in London. So the United Kingdom remembers its women. Do we? This is a photograph of the Women in Military Service Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. Inside this building is really a museum. This is with basically where each one of these arches is, and behind that, these are these are display cases behind these, where they do photographs, memorabilia, and so forth of women from different wars and from different branches of the military. What about Erie County? If we were doing a face-to-face thing, I would ask you, does Erie County remember the women who served in World War II? And of course, this is Erie's War Memorial, World War II Memorial, and Claire Reilly's name is on here. And I think this is a beautiful memorial, but I couldn't find anything to show that there was a similar kind of recognition for the women of Erie County who served. And maybe there is, and I just didn't find it. And if there is, I hope somebody out there will tell me. So I just want to conclude with my last page, my acknowledgements. This is not a bibliography. This is just an acknowledgements page to the women of Erie County who served the nation during World War II. I have nowhere covered even a drop in the bucket of those women who served. There are thousands. Bill Welch, whom I met a number of years ago, I looked at his interview with Dessi. Two of my students, John Reilly and Robin Archer, who interviewed her in April of 2001. Dave Neal, a student who did the Mildred Gear interview. I interviewed Bill Welch, Marjorie Louise Jorgensen back in the early 2000s. Donna Mook interviewed Marjorie Troop. I used, there's information from the National Archives. And last but not least, the Erie County Historical Society Archives and Anita Andrick, who is retired now, who was a great source of help to me when I was doing this research. So thank you very much.
Kara, thank you. That was fantastic. World War II, no doubt, is that benchmark event in the 20th century, if not in all of American history, that really stands out. And what has struck me so powerfully, when we had our World War II exhibit in 2017, we have a large, matter of fact, it's still there, a large photograph of Omaha Beach 24 days after the invasion of Normandy. Mm-hmm. And what struck me was everything in that picture, from the clothing to the ships, to the vehicles, to the equipment, was made in the United States. Mm-hmm. And it was probably made during the war. I mean, less than 2 years or 3 years
Absolutely.
before. And not only do we need to recognize the women who served in the military, but the people like the Rosie the Riveters who served in the factories. Or, I've always joked that I don't care if a serviceman, distributed mail at Fort Dix or if he jumped into Normandy. He served,
Yeah,
and so did the women.
absolutely.
My mother, who graduated from high school in 1942, joked about she fought the Battle of the Homefront, but yet she worked at Talon Zipper Company in Meadville, which
Mhm.
made millions probably of zippers for the military. I mean, it
Yeah.
seems like such a small thing. But yeah, I think
Absolutely.
those women need to be recognized as well.
Oh,
as
I
well.
agree. And, when I was doing this work, I interviewed Carolyn Rhodes, who I don't know if you know her, maybe you do.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. She was, a school teacher, social studies school teacher for years, but she was also mayor of the borough of Edinburgh at one point. And I interviewed her for the documentary that we did. And she educated me about, the women that, like her mother, she said, she was from Buffalo. She said her mother, didn't work in the factories, but her mother babysat other women's children so they could go to work in the factories. And that's definitely a group that we
Absolutely.
explore. And, there were thousands of young women and men too, who were carted out to the countryside to work on farms, to plant and harvest crops for the war effort.
How many times have you said to yourself in these past few years, if only we could get that same kind of enthusiasm or energy that was exhibited by the American people during World War II?
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
Jared, at this point, we have no questions.
Oh, okay, good.
Coming
Well,
from
that's fine.
Facebook. And I just want to thank you and thank Sarah Little, our tech support, and all of you out there who watched us online.